Welcome to week number 8 of DNA Building Blocks of a Biblical Church. I hope you've been helped by this so far. I hope you've been encouraged about what we believe as a church, why we do the things that we do, and I hope that it's just really fueled your desire to be faithful, be a part of our church family, to understand what that means, your responsibility as a congregation, and so on. Today, we are going to be talking about the 7th distinctive, and that is religious liberty. Last week, we talked about soul freedom or individual responsibility, where we focused on the individual's responsibility before God. This week is really going to be an application of that as we talk about the relationship between the church and the state. This is definitely a significant aspect of Baptist history. You're going to find some echoes of this idea in the church, and the Baptist church particularly, as well as in the Constitution of the United States. Baptists are not the only people who believe this. However, there are some unique roles that it has played a significant part in our history. I hope that you find this discussion particularly encouraging, because as we go into an election season, the relationship between the church and the state is probably on all of our minds. I also hope that in your discussion time that you can focus your attention on the biblical principles here at play that are generally true, not only true the last week of October in 2020. Because believe me, I am aware of the cultural context as we're having this discussion. I hope it doesn't turn into another place for heated political discussion, but instead is a place for us to turn our minds to the Word of God as we think about the relationship between the church and the state. As we've said before, there is sometimes correlation between American ideals and Baptist ideals. And we don't want to believe anything because it's American, because our culture tells us to. We want to believe the things that we believe because they're biblical. So let's look at the biblical reasons why Baptists have historically believed in separation of church and state. The first reason we believe this is that we understand that worship is a matter of the heart, not something that is externally focused. In Matthew 15, Jesus speaks to the Pharisees and he says this, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" So these Pharisees took the religious teachings, they focused on the law, they focused on the external aspects of the religious teachings, and called that faithfulness to God. Jesus condemns that in no uncertain terms with the Pharisees, that they were teaching the traditions of men as being what God has said. Jesus is certainly opposed to that. When we apply this to religion today, when we apply this to matters of faith today, we understand that sure, I could make someone come to church. I could make someone tithe. I could make someone do any number of religious exercises. What I could never make someone do is worship God with their heart. And so we recognize that we cannot force worship, because the worship that is coerced is utterly false worship. In fact, if someone is being forced to sing praise to God who does not believe it, it looks more like blasphemy than like worship. Unfortunately, the church has not always been consistent with this. From the time of Constantine in the 4th century, when Christianity becomes a legal religion in the Roman Empire, all the way through the Middle Ages, even to the early times of the Protestant Reformation, we see this unholy alliance between the church and the state. And frankly, when the church and state are allied, the church tends to not do its job very well, and the state tends to not do its job very well. Baptists realize that the church and the state are distinct from one another. They have different spheres of responsibility. They have different tasks. The state cannot force worship. It cannot coerce worship. The church has its own job to do. And so these two distinct spheres become an important and central part of the Baptist view of the relationship between the church and the state. Why do we see a distinction between these two entities? Well, I would start by saying that Jesus himself saw a distinction between these entities. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus says this, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." In this account, Jesus is answering some questions about paying taxes. He pulls out a coin, points out that Caesar's head is on it, and says, "Give your taxes to Caesar." It is Jesus' expectation that in the sphere of human government, Caesar has rights. Caesar owns things. And so he tells the people to give to Caesar what belongs to him. So he makes this distinction between what is Caesar's and what is God's. Not only does he make a distinction between what is Caesar's and what is God's, Jesus also emphasizes the nature of his kingdom. In John 18:36, Jesus says this, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." There will come a day when Jesus' kingdom is advanced by means of warfare, but that is sometime far in the future when Jesus himself rules on the earth as a king. When he institutes his physical kingdom, that day comes. But right now, we wait for that day, but we do not expect his kingdom to be of this world, and we do not use the tools of the kingdoms of this world to advance his kingdom. This is why we have these two spheres of power: the sphere of human government and the church. They operate differently, they have different goals, they have different tools. Let's talk a little bit about the tools they have by talking about the power that they hold. We use two terms to refer to the distinct tools, the distinct powers of the church and the state. The church holds what we call the power of the keys, while the state holds what we call the power of the sword. First, let's look at the power of the sword. I want to start by emphasizing that the power of the sword is no less God-given than the power of the keys. We can see this from Romans 13, verse 1, where it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." So God gives to the earth certain government authorities. He institutes these powers, these kings on the earth. They're given by God. What king is Paul referring to? Well, he's writing to Rome at the height of the Roman Empire. The emperor at this time is likely Emperor Nero, one of the most wicked men to rule in history. Tradition tells us that Nero would take Christians, dip them in tar, and light them on fire and use them as torches to light his garden parties at night. This is not a good man. This is not a good king. Yet Paul says that all authority is given by God. So even the worst earthly kings are in some sense authorities who have their authority from God. What is the authority that these kings have? Well, it's a power of life and death. Going on in Romans 13, it says this, "Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will have his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." And that's why we call this the power of the sword. Here in Romans 13, it says that he does not bear the sword in vain. The government is given power by God even up to and including capital punishment, even including death. That's why the metaphor of the sword is used to describe this authority. This is consistent with Old Testament institutions of civil government. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, it says this, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." God institutes human governments to shed the blood of those who shed men's blood. And this is not because human life is so little that you can shed blood for no good cause. It's because human life is so significant. It's life in God's image. And so therefore, you shed blood when blood is shed to value the image of God. This is a power that's given to man, given to these earthly governments. And in Romans 13, that power is continued when Caesar, when the governor bears the sword, and he does not bear it in vain. He is a terror to evildoers. So the government is given this authority to punish wrongdoing, evildoing. This is why the Bible is 100% okay with a government that makes certain laws for how the world is supposed to function, that makes laws about taxes. Those are clearly biblical, at least to some extent, according to Jesus paying Caesar's taxes. To make laws about violent crimes and things like that, the government is given the responsibility to uphold good and condemn evil. And that's a God-given responsibility. We call this the power of the sword. But the power of the sword is not the only kind of power. There's another kind of power that, though sounding a whole lot less powerful, is actually even more significant. That's the power that God gives the church, which we call the power of the keys. We've talked about the power of the keys before. We talked about it when talking about the role of the congregation and the church, that the congregation, that the church together has the power to open and shut the doors of heaven, the power of the keys. The church has a power that extends beyond this physical world. Because we live in the physical world, oftentimes the spiritual things seem less significant than the physical things because we can touch and feel what happens in this world. But Jesus in Matthew 16 and Matthew 18 gives the church this great power, the power of the keys. The church has a responsibility to recognize who Jesus is, to administer his commands, so that people would know how to be saved, so that people would gain entrance into the kingdom through the work of the church. And so the church has the power of the keys, the state has the power of the sword. It is interesting that not only is the church not given the power of the sword, it's actually explicitly forbidden the power of the sword. Matthew 26:52. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Jesus there is talking to the apostle Peter. Now, at that time, he's the disciple Peter. And Peter has just taken out his sword to defend Jesus and cut off a servant's ear in order to defend Jesus. But Jesus tells Peter, no, you do not hold the power of the sword. Do not live by the sword. How significant must this be that Peter, the disciple, the apostle, the rock on whom the church is built, is told not to live by the sword. So we have these two distinctive spheres, the church and the state, each holding different powers, using those powers towards different ends. Let's make this a little bit harder. Let's talk about the practical applications of the separation of church and state. First of all, I want to talk about what we do when the government tells us to disobey God. This is actually a really simple, easy question to answer. When God and man are in conflict, we always, always, always obey God. Acts 5, verse 29 says this, we must obey God rather than men. In this particular context, the church at Jerusalem is preaching Jesus Christ. The religious leaders, who are the government leaders at the time, are forbidding them from preaching Jesus Christ. Peter says, no, we're not listening to you. We obey God instead of man. So, when God and man are in conflict, we obey God. This does not mean that the state can't make any laws that have anything to do with our religious worship. We acknowledge that the state has the right to make laws about things like zoning and building codes, tax laws. We pay taxes as a church. Now, that might seem unusual to you because churches are tax exempt in this country. For one thing, that's a political thing, not a religious thing. So even if that law changes, I don't think we're justified in not paying our taxes. But because we rent out our facility, portions of our facility are subject to property tax. And we willingly pay that property tax. When we can obey both God and man, we obey both. It is only when we cannot obey both that we choose to obey God instead of man. So let's ask a harder question. Are there times, other times besides obeying God instead of man, that Christians can disobey the laws of their land? Well, this is a pretty hard question to answer. I do want to make a few points, and then I'll say some questions that I'm just not going to answer in this context because I don't think I have the biblical authority to answer them well. But I will say this. In the Bible, on at least 3 occasions, there are times where God's people make an appeal to government authorities which allows them to disobey a command of the government. The first time that I can think of is in Ezra, chapters 4 through 6. Jerusalem is being rebuilt, rather the temple is being rebuilt by Israel returning from exile. And in this process, some of the surrounding leaders tell them to stop rebuilding. Well, they write an appeal and they write a letter to Cyrus appealing based on a letter that had been written in the past, granting them the right to rebuild the temple. So they appeal to him. There are some difficult interpretational issues in that account that we're not going to get into, but the clear thing that happens is that they write an appeal, that appeal is granted, and they continue rebuilding the city. Something similar happens in Acts chapter 16. Paul is beaten in Philippi, he's put in jail, and as he is being released and encouraged to leave the city, he says, no, you guys have wronged me because I'm a Roman citizen. He makes an appeal to Roman law about the wrongness of the way the Philippians had treated him. Another time with Paul is when he stands before Festus, and this is in Acts chapter 25. In Acts 25, Festus wants to send Paul to Jerusalem where he's going to be tried by the Jews. Paul recognizes this is going to be a sham trial, so instead of going along with it, he says, I appeal to Caesar. That was his right as a Roman citizen. So there is legitimate biblical case for making appeals. Now, there are some difficult questions that follow up that legitimate biblical case. Questions like, can we disobey to make an appeal? In the United States, that is often a part of the judicial process, that disobedience to make an appeal in court. That's a difficult question, one that I don't think we have super clear biblical answer, but it's going to be a matter of wisdom and grace as we work through that question. There are going to be some other difficult questions that I'm not going to answer here, but I think are worth mentioning. How about disobedience to conquerors? If China took over America, would it be wrong for us to rebel against China if they're conquering? I would say no, but I do think there's a question of when is disobedience to a conqueror okay? When is it not okay? If a nation has ruled another nation for 200 years so that they're not really even a conqueror, they're just the government of the land, then is it okay? Is it not okay? Those are wisdom issues. I think as we navigate through these questions, it's important that we remember a few things. First of all, we do not do anything that will do damage to another person's conscience. So we want to be very cautious in forcing other people to violate their conscience and their obedience to the government. Another aspect also from Romans 14 is that we don't serve as judge over our master's servant. We don't serve as judge over other Christians who come to a different place on legitimately difficult theological questions like this. We're living in a world where this is a question more than it ever has been in my lifetime and probably in your lifetime. As we deal with mask laws and COVID guidelines, meeting capacities, things like that, we're dealing with some unprecedented times in our country. So I would encourage everyone in our church to think about a few things as it relates to this issue. Number one, like I just said, be on guard for the conscience of others. Don't put them in a place where they are violating their conscience. Don't force them to violate their conscience. Additionally, if someone's conscience may not be bothered by something you think it should be bothered by, then let's be careful that we do not serve as judge over another servant of our master. Finally, think biblically about these questions. Think it is far too easy when dealing with restrictions that we don't like, from a government that we disagree with, from a governor who we don't trust, that we just decide to disobey laws because we don't like them. That's not biblical. There may be good reason to disobey a law, but let's make sure that we recognize that separation of church and state includes certain powers granted to the state. And we ought to humbly listen to those. We ought to honor our governor. We ought to pray for our governor, even when we disagree with him. So I'm not going to answer all the hows and whys of what you specifically should do. I have to be responsible for my own conscience. But let me just strongly encourage our church family that you think biblically about these questions rather than just doing what you want. Let's talk about history. I'm really excited for this section. There's lots of interesting stories here. We think of freedom of religion in the United States as being something that's being taken away from us. The reality is at the founding and before the founding of our country, it was far worse than it was today. Religious freedom is something that has developed over time. If we go back before the founding of the country, we have people like Roger Williams. We talked about him last week. He was exiled from Boston for preaching, for teaching some things about faith and conscience that the government didn't like. He was kicked out of the colony. This happened other times. Baptist preachers were deported for their message, removed from colonies. Roger Williams wrote about the need for it to be different. When he wrote this phrase, he talked about a hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. There you see some of the first ideas of separation of church and state coming from the pen of Roger Williams. Other Baptist pastors faced similar things. Some were beaten. From 1768 to 1777, 30 pastors were imprisoned in Virginia. There were established churches in the north. There were established congregational churches in the south, established Anglican churches. By established, I mean that the state or the colony would have an official church that your taxes would support. You would be required to pay taxes to support the pastor of the church. You might not be required to attend, but you were required to give to that church. This is the situation in America at the time of our founding. And in fact, when the Constitution was initially written in 1787 and brought back to the states, it was presented to them with very little guarantee of religious liberty. The only thing that was in there was the prohibition on a religious test for federal office. No prohibition for a religious test on state or local office. No guarantee for free exercise or establishment of religion. None of that. It was simply no religious test for federal office. So when this happens, the Constitutional Convention ends, the committee members go back to their home states, and they are going to be presenting the Constitution of their states to be ratified. And Virginia, this is not a certain thing, because there's a group of Baptists led by a man by the name of John Leland. John Leland and James Madison, the author of the Constitution, the primary man who crafted that, James Madison and John Leland became friends at this time because John Leland was selected as a representative of a bunch of Baptists in his area to say that they were deeply concerned about the lack of religious liberty protections. In fact, if you read the preamble to the Bill of Rights, it says this: the conventions of a number of the states having at the time of their adopting the Constitution expressed a desire, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses should be added, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of its institution. So these groups had this influence that we need our liberty protected more. John Leland was able to convince James Madison of that. He brought it back, and Congress wrote the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed freedom of religion. Just want to read a few quotes from John Leland that will help give you an idea of what he thought about the separation of church and state, about freedom of religion. He says this: "Guard against those men who make a great noise about religion in choosing representatives. It is electioneering intrigue. If they knew the nature and worth of religion, they would not debauch it to such shameful purposes. If pure religion is the criterion to decide upon candidates, those who make a noise about it must be rejected, for their wrangle about it proves that they are void of it. Let honesty, talents, and quick dispatch characterize the men of your choice." So he says, don't listen to people talking about how religious they are in an election, because humility is a better sign of their religion than their boastfulness about the religion that they practice. Another time he speaks, he says this: "Persecution, like a lion, tears the saints to death, but leaves Christianity pure. State establishment of religion, like a bear, hugs the saints, but corrupts Christianity." So he recognized that persecution would actually strengthen the church, but the embrace of the state would do great damage to it. Another time, Leland, talking about freedom of religion for all people, said this: "Government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely, and see that one does not abuse another. The liberty I contend for is more than toleration. The very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes that some have preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians." So Leland took that belief and the freedom of conscience and said, you cannot force someone to be a Christian. Some laws guaranteed religious freedom for Protestants. He insisted that religious freedom should truly be for everyone. Leland was good friends with Thomas Jefferson. He supported Thomas Jefferson to become the president because he believed that he would be the one most likely to guarantee the freedom of religion, the freedom of worship. In fact, in 1802, after Jefferson was elected, Leland and his congregation up in Connecticut, he had moved from Virginia at that time, sent a giant 1,325-pound wheel of cheese to President Jefferson that said America's greatest cheese for America's greatest man. And so he was good friends with Jefferson. Jefferson is actually the person who we would point to as coining the term, as I just said, separation of church and state. He coined that term in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Convention in Danbury, Connecticut. He was responding to their concerns about their freedom of religion, because up in Danbury in Connecticut, there was still established religion in the Congregational church. And Jefferson says to them, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." So even the phrase separation of church and state comes in a letter to Baptists because Baptists are concerned for liberty of conscience. Hope you've learned some things from that. I know that it's interesting to me when we start talking about freedom of religion, we start talking about kind of American history, that certainly scratches some itches for things that I really enjoy looking into. That really brings us to the end of this study. You've got some questions to discuss with your group leader. Can I just encourage you? We're in the middle of a political season and we're talking about separation of church and state. I think it would be unfortunate if we got more distracted by the current events of our day than by thinking biblically about the big principles of this topic. So let me just encourage you in your discussion time, do your best to do it without saying Trump or Biden or Republicans or Democrats thinking about really the news. Instead, think about the Bible and the applications that we should draw from what the Bible teaches us about this topic. This is the last in the series, so you don't have any scheduled small groups coming up. We will re-begin small groups in January, might make some tweaks to it, things like that, but for November and December, we're not continuing small groups. However, you've carved out a night out of your week to spend with God's people. Can I just encourage you to try and continue doing that? Maybe that means you continue to meet with your small group to read the Bible together, talk about the sermon, read a book together, do something like that. Or take it as an opportunity to get to know some of the people at church that you don't know. Invite people over to your house and have dinner. You've already gotten used to having Monday night, Tuesday night, or Wednesday night be a night where you fellowship with Christ's body. So continue doing that as we get into the fall and Christmas season, as we look forward to having small group again in January. Don't let up on building biblical community. We've got lots of new people at church. This is a great way to get to know them by just spending time with one another on the night that you have been having small group. We'll see you next time we meet.